I want to talk with you today about using accessibility as a design tool. We've done a lot of work in the last 15 years, which makes me feel really old, that leads me to believe that accessibility is a design tool that we need to add to our arsenal when we're taking on any project. I work at a small company called Simply Accessible. This is what we do. We focus on accessibility for people with disabilities all the time. And we've had kind of the privilege of working on projects where we're not only doing UX work and usability work, but also accessibility work. And we've seen a lot of things happen where we've made changes for people with disabilities that have just made things better for everybody else. And seeing that over and over and over again has kind of led us to believe that there's something there, something that we need as designers and developers to kind of grab hold of. So this is me. I'm Feather on Twitter. If you want to connect, feel free to reach out to me there. If you want to email me, feel free. feather@simplyaccessible.com, totally fine. You can email me. Preferably animated GIFs would be good if you want to send those over, because I like those. So we do a lot of design workshops, and this is, does anybody recognize what this is on the screen? This is like the original Microsoft Surface, the table, like not the little surfaces that they have now, but it was like the 4-foot by 3-foot table. And when I first, I saw this for the first time, I think in 2007 at a conference where it was kind of unveiled, and I was all over it. I'm like, oh, I want to talk about the accessibility of this device. Is it accessible? What can we do? How could this device actually make things more accessible for people with disabilities? And we started to look at this photo app, and I use this as an exercise in a lot of our full-day workshops, where we basically unpack this photo app from an accessibility perspective. And we look at all kinds of different disabilities, and we come up with all kinds of different challenges that people face when they're using this app, depending on their disability. So one of them, for example, is for somebody that has low vision. They're not blind, they can still see, but when they look at this, one of the problems that they might have is that they would have trouble distinguishing one photo from the next, particularly in a pile like this, where there's not really, you've got a small, thin white border around each photo. For somebody with low vision, that may be really difficult to distinguish between the border of one photo and where one photo finishes and the other starts. For somebody that has a cognitive difficulty, that they require, and I do mean require, they require a certain amount of order in the interface. This view may be enough to actually stop somebody with a particular type of, say, autism, where they fit somewhere on the autism spectrum. This clutter in the interface might be enough to actually stop them from using the app. So they maybe need something where they have a mode where they can tap on the surface and say, lock this down to a grid so that everything becomes much more orderly and easy for them to understand. So we go through activities like this, and we try to put ourselves in the shoes of different people with different disabilities. And what usually happens is we go through all of these different ideas. So we talk about what are the challenges for somebody that is blind or that has low vision or has hearing difficulties, maybe even mobility or dexterity impairment. So somebody may have real challenges with fine motor control. It might be very difficult for them to have a steady hand as they're trying to manipulate that interface, to take a photo, and I don't know if you saw them, but each one of those photos is zoomable. It was one of the original kind of pinch zoom type interfaces. For somebody that has only one hand, that pinch zoom is going to be tough to do, especially on a large table. When you've got a photo that is maybe already 8 inches by 10 inches. So for them to grab the corners and zoom it, if they've only got one hand, that's going to be a challenge for them. And so we go through all of these different things and try to come up with as many issues as we can, things that are going to challenge people. On the cognitive side, right? What about people that have attention deficits or memory-related issues or literacy-related issues, or even people that require that routine and predictability? So we look at all of these vestibular disorders. Have you heard of vestibular disorders? Does anybody know somebody that has, I can't even see, so you can pretend to put up your hand and it's totally fine because the light is like right on me. Does anybody know anybody that has a vestibular disorder? People are just getting into this now and understanding what happens. A vestibular disorder is where it's kind of like constant motion sickness, or constant vertigo, when looking at a web page actually brings on this feeling of nausea and even migraines or all kinds of other side effects, dizziness, vertigo, whatever you want to call it. And it actually limits the amount of work that people can do. So you know that fancy parallax effect that you create? That motion can actually cause people to kind of physically become ill. And so what is the impact of that on that interface, on that surface table, for example? If you had those photos and you had the ability to create a rotating slideshow, would something like that trigger some kind of issues for somebody with a vestibular disorder? So we think about these kinds of things all the time. We think about what the impact of that interface is on somebody with speech difficulties. And we're seeing more and more prevalence of speech, of speech recognition in interfaces. Well, what does that mean for somebody that has a stutter? What does it mean for somebody that doesn't speak, that English isn't their first language? What does that mean for somebody that has cerebral palsy and has difficulty speaking in the first place? Right? And so what do we do with that type of scenario? How do we design for that? So we usually come up with a whole list of issues, and I'm not going to go through every one of them, but we usually break them down. And people are, this is what I love, is designers and developers are smart. Right? We can project all of these things. We can put ourselves into the shoes of somebody with a disability, even if it may be accurate, it may be inaccurate, but that exercise of kind of getting outside of ourselves and stepping into the shoes of somebody else yields pretty awesome results. And almost every single time I do one of these design workshops, whether it's a surface table or it's a website or it's anything else, we almost always end up with a quote like this. Somebody at the end of the workshop says, you know, this stuff is great, and yes, everything that we've done, that you've showed us makes this more accessible, but you actually just created a better design, right? It was just better, more well thought out design in the first place. And this is why I kind of get excited about this type of topic, right? How do we use accessibility to make things better? And I am all for you. You know, a lot of clients mandate accessibility now. It's a must-have for a project. I am all for you saying, well, it needs to be accessible. Use that as much as you can to just make the design better for everybody. Right? Take that, leverage it. Oh, I said that leverage word. But use accessibility to your advantage to improve your design for everyone. This phenomenon kind of interests me all the time. So I have a biology background. I was a biologist, and I got into teaching high school biology, chemistry, and computers before I got into the web. And this is a pretty typical distribution of a characteristic within a population. So in any population, we have all range. And this is just sort of looking at size. So you have somebody that's smaller or shorter, that's right fit, and somebody that's taller and larger, and then you have a big cluster of people in the middle. But we have these extremes, right? And then we have a cluster in the middle. And we look at characteristics that way, not in terms of just physical size, but if you look at this in terms of any ability, it kind of illuminates things in a slightly different way. There's a great video that I like to watch every once in a while because I'm weird that way. But IDEO is a design company here in the US, and they have this video. It was a special on ABC, and it's called The Deep Dive. And if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to watch it. Just search for The Deep Dive. And I love it because they go through and they talk about the design process and what they do and how they kind of do research on an idea. And so what they were looking to do was to design a better shopping cart, and not a digital like e-commerce shopping cart, an actual physical, I'm going into the supermarket to get groceries shopping cart. And so as they were doing that, they started to unpack, well, how do people use shopping carts? They use it to carry their kids. They use it to put their purse in. They use it to load groceries up, to unload groceries, to transport them to the car. And there were all kinds of different scenarios that they go through. And one of the things, and I hate this, but you know, a traditional shopping cart, you get all, excuse me, get all your food in there, you unload it, you load it back all in, and you can't find the things that are kind of on the bottom, and you end up squishing your bread. You ever get squished bread? That's not good for anybody, right? So what they did as part of this was that they, around the outside of the shopping cart, they set it up so that there were hooks all around the top of the shopping cart so that you could hang your bags, so that you didn't have to like pile bag on top of another bag on top of another bag, because they were trying to save people from squishing their bread. So they created it so that they hung it around the outside. It was actually really kind of interesting. And one of the best quotes from the video was this. I love this idea. By examining the extreme ends of a set of phenomena in depth, the entire universe of relationships can be illuminated, since other instances fall somewhere between on the map of relationships and links. If we look at the extremes, everybody else is kind of going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Think of that binomial distribution. Somebody that has no vision, somebody that has normal vision or supervision, because it could happen, in my mind anyway. Everybody's going to have vision that falls somewhere in between no vision and supervision, no hearing and perfect hearing, and no dexterity or very little dexterity and perfect dexterity. And so we started to look at this and trying to understand that from an accessibility perspective and how we can project these needs onto a design. So we have, traditionally most people have kind of thought of accessibility as this black or white thing, like you have an accessible site or you don't have an accessible site. Someone is blind or they're not blind. But that's really not true. It's not black or white. We have all kinds of shades of gray in between. And how you look at that kind of frames everything that you're going to learn and do about accessibility. So let's look at accessibility as a design tool. And I've got kind of 7 different lessons here that I want to share with you. And these are things that are from real projects, things that we've learned over the years of how putting accessibility into the design process and specific accessibility needs actually helps make things better for everybody. So the first is to start with content. And everybody wants their thing to be first, right? Content first, mobile first. Everything needs to be first at some point. We have to think about all these things up front. I want to give you a really quick example. This is a listing of healthcare providers. We were doing work with a client that's a healthcare insurance provider, and they basically created this list. So it was a very straightforward search for healthcare providers within 5 miles of this zip code, and they get this list, and this could all be made perfectly accessible from a technical perspective. But when we started working with them on this, I asked them the question. I said, have you considered that in the decision-making process for someone, when they're looking at this and trying to decide which healthcare provider to go to, that is not just about distance? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, for somebody with a disability, they might actually travel 5 miles farther or 10 miles farther, 30 miles farther, because they're going to see a particular specialist that is really relevant to them. Or they may actually travel farther, not just because of needing to see a specialist, but because the wheelchair ramp is right at the front of the building instead of all the way around the side of the building. Right? That kind of stuff matters when somebody with a disability is choosing a healthcare provider. And so we talked about that as a content need, right? What content needs are there for people with disabilities? Do they have specific pieces of content that they actually need to make decisions and to move forward and to be able to choose a healthcare provider? And so we look for look for things like that all the time. Are there things that people with disabilities need? They need the same content as everybody else, but they also need content that is specific to them. So your job as a designer really is to go and find out what that content is, right? For somebody, if you're working on a site that is all about movies, for example, when somebody with a disability wants to go to a movie, they need to find out information like, are there captions for this movie available, right? What kind of a captioning device is it? I was at the movies the other day with my 10-year-old son, and right beside us was a guy who had basically a caption viewer. It went into the little drink cup that was there. It plugged in there essentially, and it was like this gooseneck arm type thing, and it brought a little caption display up right in front of him. So he didn't need to go into a specific theater. It was actually set up for him that he could go into any theater in that complex and see any movie, right? That's not the case everywhere. So for that type of scenario, some people might need to know, hey, is there captions available for this? What kind of device is it? Am I going to get any value out of this at all? We also want to move from what to why. We often think about what we're building, but we often forget about why we're building it. This was a site, and this is a fictionalized example, but we were working with a client where they were basically showing kind of a boundary change. So this is the city of Ottawa. This is where I'm from. And you can see there's kind of a purple polygon and a blue polygon. And ultimately what they were doing was they wanted to show how what a change in boundary was going to be. And so they visualized this on a map because everybody wants maps on their sites because they can. And so when they looked at this, they actually started thinking about accessibility, and they said, well, how do we make this accessible to someone that can't see those boundaries, right? What do we do for them? And so the accessibility need was that we needed non-visual access for what was being represented with those polygons. And so they started coming up with different ideas. They said things like, well, every polygon there is really just a set of latitude and longitude coordinates, right? So we could provide that as data, as a feed. Somebody could take that and put it into another tool. They looked at it and said, well, we could use just some text to describe the boundaries. So it would be something along along the lines of, the current city of Ottawa is bounded to the north by the Ottawa River. It extends to the west to Arnprior, where the border for the city moves 5 miles southwest, and then heads southeast for 50 miles or whatever it is. And they were coming up with these textual descriptions. And then they said they would describe so here's the current one, here's the proposed one, and they would go through all these textual-based descriptions because they know they need to provide non-visual access to this. So how do they do it? They came up with other things like they said, well, maybe we don't need to describe the individual polygons, but maybe what we need to describe is the difference, right? Maybe it's about the difference. So it would be easier for them to say the new proposed boundary would extend the city's boundary on the southeast side by 10 miles or something like that, and on the southeast side by 5 miles or whatever it was. And they go through all these different iterations of trying to figure out how to provide non-visual access to this very visual interface. And so I've asked them, I said, so why is this map on the site in the first place? Right? Why does this matter? Right? They were really focused on, we need to have a map and we need to have an accessible map. So how are we going to do that? And I asked them, I said, well, why are people even going to look at this? Like, why does this matter? Why does a proposed city boundary change matter to anybody? Number one reason, you know this, is one of the two certain things in life. Right. It's all about taxes, right? The main reason that people want to know about this boundary change is whether or not it's going to have an impact on their taxes. There may be other reasons, but that's a big one. And so what they really are after is, does this affect me, right? Knowing whether or not this affects them is the reason for this map to be on there. So when we got to that reason, when we said, well, why, right? Why is this map even there in the first place? They came up with a completely different solution, and it was just something like this. right? Instead of worrying about providing 100% full non-visual access to those overlapping polygons, because they knew why they were trying to provide it, they changed the solution. They just said, well, why don't we do a little postal code lookup? Then you know right away, does this impact you? Yes, you're inside the new boundary of the city of Ottawa. Congratulations, your taxes will go up. I mean, you will get much more service for the... They changed it because they knew why, right? They knew why they were putting this on there in the first place. And so instead of focusing on a visual description of what they were showing visually, they were giving people... The number one reason people were coming there was to figure out if it actually impacted them, so they created a new way. They allowed people multiple methods for getting the same information. That's a critical piece for accessibility, is not relying on just one method to get something done. We have a goal, let's find multiple ways of achieving the same thing. So when you move from what to why, you allow people to solve the same problem in multiple ways, right? And that's a critical piece for accessibility. We have a podcast, and we thought we were doing a great job. We were providing the transcript right away. So we never launched an episode of the podcast without the transcript going live, like right then and there, so that people with hearing difficulties, they get the information at the same time as everybody else. And one of our listeners kind of said, hey, you know, I'm deaf. It would be really helpful for me to have a downloadable copy of this. Like, and I'm asking, like, oh, tell me more about this. Like, why? And she said, well, podcasts are great for somebody that wants to load them up on their iPhone or their iPod or whatever other. Are there other MP3 players? Put them on my device and take them for my commute. And she said to me, I can't use those audio files that way. I would love a downloadable copy that I could put on my ebook reader, right? Exactly the same way, so that she could take them for her commute and read them in exactly the same way. And I was like, oh, of course, right? So providing that audio, that podcast is a great idea, but we can get that information through to the same, to serve the same purpose by putting it into a downloadable format as well, just a text-based format. So that was actually kind of a revelation for me as well. Like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense, but I'd kind of forgotten why. I was so caught up in the technical, we have to have a transcript available. I didn't even think about making it so that it was easily downloadable and transferable to an e-reader. Lesson number 3, proximity. So this is a design principle that you should all be familiar with. I stayed at a hotel in London in the UK, and I had this for my faucet, where I had a hot water tap on the left and another hot water tap on the right. I didn't know what to do, so I'm like, I'm out. I'll be dirty for today. I'm not doing this. And it didn't make sense until I saw this that told me that the left tap operates the shower and the right tap operates the bath. So now I at least know if I'm going to burn my head or my feet. The problem was that the faucet is down there and the instructions are about 6 feet away on the side wall. Now, you all know that those instructions need to be right there, but they're not. They need to be in the line of sight. Right? We need to do things in interface where we group those closely related items. We need to put them together because they belong together. This is critical for everybody, but for somebody that has low vision, this is everything. So when we're looking at a layout, we need to consider that idea of proximity, and we also need to consider the pattern of use that we have for somebody with low vision. This is a form that was coded to be perfectly accessible. Right? It was very screen reader friendly. It did the job. It did the trick. It was accessible. We can dust off our hands and we're finished. And when we're assessing this and we're looking at it, we put on the lens of somebody with low vision and how they're going to use this form. You can see that there's chunks of information here. We've got these 2 questions and these 2 answers and these 2 questions and these 2 answers. And we see that we've got these buttons at the bottom and these hidden open tips things that almost nobody ever sees. I want you to step through this, and we're going to look at this from the perspective of somebody that has low vision. So this is where I'm going to ask you to participate. You don't have to talk, you don't have to do anything, but you do need to take either your left hand or your right hand, and I want you to make a fist and look through like you're holding a straw. And I want you to look at this interface and go through the motion of actually filling out this form, okay? I mean it, you have to do it. And while you're doing it, I will take a photo of you. This is one of my favorite parts of teaching about accessibility. So, what did you need to do to fill out that form? A lot of this, right? Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. So think about this. For somebody that has low vision, they're zoomed in. So I'm going to simulate this. You're simulating it by looking through the straw. I'm going to zoom it in here. So ultimately what you're looking at, somebody that has low vision, they may be using a magnifier. They may only see this part of the screen, right? They see a limited chunk of the screen at a time, which is why we look through the straw. So when I get to these questions and I scroll over to get to those answers, I've lost all the context about what those questions even were, right? We've got the wrong associations. There's 2 questions and 2 sets of answers, and they're technically perfect for a screen reader user, but they suck for a low vision user. All right, so we get this motion back and forth, back and forth. We come down to these other set of questions. We come back to these other questions, the answers. And what's the pattern that we created? Left, right, left, right, left, right, left. Oh, that's a great call to action for right now. And right underneath the answers, the yes-no answers, happen to be this. Like kind of all of the calls to action that we don't really want people to take were the ones that we presented first for somebody with low vision. What else did you notice about the buttons? The quit, previous, and next, the same color, same size, same font, same everything. The only way to distinguish between those buttons is you have to read them, right? You have to read. We changed up this design, and we weren't able to push this through, but we changed up the design to make it much more simple. We used layout to create the right chunks. So we still have 4 chunks, but it's all question and answer together, question and answer together, right? So now, use the straw. You'll never, ever eliminate left to right scrolling, but how much is there? Almost none, right? Almost none. You will never eliminate the need to scroll. That's always going to be there for somebody with low vision. But what we can do is make it more efficient. And I love this because this need for creating this streamlined interface is really fantastic for mobile interfaces as well. Right? For a narrow device display, this works really well. So now when we're zoomed in, it's like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. And what's there? Big fat call to action with some visual distinction to it that says, yeah, this is the thing we want you to do. So we're using this idea of the straw test to simulate low vision. What it does is it helps you create designs that are better, generally speaking, for everyone. Right? I want you to use that straw test every single time that you're creating a design. When you're working with the design, you look for things like that, and you will find them. You'll find them everywhere, right? What inefficiencies are created, and we saw this the other day in an app where there was like editing a title and there was a done button right beside it, and then all kinds of other fields that you could change, and there was no button at the bottom that allowed you to do the same thing, to save it or to say you were done. So the low vision user, they go from that title down through all the other fields that are there, and they get to the end and they're expecting to see some kind of a finish button or a save. And they had to go all the way up to the top right corner to find it, right? It's just not there. It's not an expected place. So I really want you to think about this. Examine your interfaces using that straw test. You will find so much. You'll unearth design problems and layout problems for people with low vision that will lead you to create better designs for everybody.